Hello, 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 and welcome to Slay to Z, a tribute to the entire song catalog of one of the greatest bands of all time, Slayer, where every episode we aim to pick, slice, and dissect all things Slayer. On this episode, we're going to fast forward to the most recent and, as of now, final Slayer album, 2015's Repentless. Our first look into this grand exit album is Atrocity Vendor. Like much of Repentless, Atrocity Vendor is a Kerry King joint, with him responsible for both the music and lyrics. But you don't need liner notes to know that. One spin of this deep cut will clue you in on both fronts, as it has all of King's writing trademarks. Atrocity Vendor is buried in the track listing on Repentless, coming in at track number 10 out of 12 total for the record, which is a bit surprising considering it is, as we'll explore further, actually a pretty strong song. Now before we go any further, I just want to take a second to recognize that this is our 10th proper episode of Slay to Z. It may not seem like much to most, but this feels like an accomplishment worth acknowledging. Many people have ideas to start a podcast, and many of those people actually get around to launching something. Indeed, Slay to Z was an idea that was cooking in my own head for probably 2 years, maybe, before I finally just said, to hell with it, I'm going to give it a go. But people really aren't kidding around when they say that producing a show is work. It really has been a lot of work. Ultimately, I think that's what ends up crashing new shows so quickly. I mean, the internet says that, on average, most new podcasts are abandoned by their creators after about 7 episodes. Hell, market research says that 90% of podcasts don't last beyond 3 episodes. How crazy is that? But we're still chugging along, and I still remain committed to the mission. I hope you continue to tune in and join the fun. So let's get back to work. Are we ready? Well, too bad, because it's time to jump into Repentless. So not only is Atrocity Vendor a Kerry King penned song, King is solely responsible for all the guitar on the song. For added context that nobody that would actually be listening to Slay to Z actually needs, Repentless was the first and only Slayer record without a Jeff Hanneman performance. In fact, Hanneman's only known contribution to the record is the song Piano Wire, which we'll get to obviously much later. Now, it was customary throughout basically the last 20-ish years of Slayer's existence for Kerry to record all the rhythm tracks on his own, even on Jeff's songs. This is ostensibly done for 2 reasons. 1, consistency and tightness of performance for a record. For those uninitiated, having 2 guitarists in a band is great for many reasons, especially in a live setting, because it reinforces the sound and keeps things sounding full even whenever one guitarist may step out for like a solo. But the studio environment is unflinching in terms of exposing all the flaws and imperfections in your playing. Things that sound great in the rehearsal room or the live stage can quickly be exposed under the sonic microscope of high-quality microphones and isolated soundproof rooms. It can show that one guitarist has sloppiness in one or both of their hands, while the other guitarist may be much more solid. Having only the guitarist with the much more dialed-in feel or skill record all the rhythm tracks themselves is a way to ensure the performance is both tight and consistent, and also efficient, which brings us to the second reason: time. Time in a professional recording studio is very expensive. Having a guitarist that is struggling with keeping their performance tight during tracking, and therefore having to spend an inordinate amount of time tracking to land an acceptable take, is costly. It can also be tremendously frustrating for all involved and sour the overall vibe of the studio and of the project. As someone who has spent even a very small amount of time working in a studio on projects, the atmosphere in the room has a massive influence on performances and therefore the finished product. It has become more known over probably the last 10 years that Jeff Hanneman had been increasingly struggling with physical challenges with his hands and arms since the 90s. He'd begun having some real difficulties playing some of the material at the required tempos and intensity, Conversely, Kerry King, regardless of what anyone may think of him as a lead player, may be one of the most underrated rhythm players in metal, and especially of the old school thrashers. His chops seem to have always been on point, both live and in the studio. When you have that available to the band, you get your ego out of the way and you do what's best for the band or project. It's a business decision, but it's also an artistic and integrity/legacy decision. King stepped up and took on the responsibility of laying down all the riffs, even those that were not his own. Hanneman, of course, would still be responsible for recording his leads because that's his personal voice shining through. But bringing us back to Repentless, and Atrocity Vendor specifically, Jeff didn't play a note. Moreover, on this song, the inimitable Gary Holt, who had stepped in Jeff's absence, he didn't even make an appearance either. Atrocity Vendor is all Kerry King. So besides context, how are the guitars on this track? Well, they're good. The guitar tone on this record is big and modern while still sounding like Slayer. There's a behind the scenes video I saw somewhere online where Kerry talks about the equipment used on Repentless. Kerry stated that he used basically the same setup he's used for years when recording this album, the primary difference being that he didn't have access to his A rig in the studio because he was overseas in preparation for some gigs that were scheduled throughout the recording process. But being that his rig primarily relies on his signature Marshall amps, he could approximate his usual sound with his B rig that was closer to home and more accessible at the time of the recording. All of this to say, it must be a testament to strong engineering and producing on the part of Terry Date to pull such a fuller guitar sound from essentially the same equipment as the previous recordings. I like the way that the guitars sound on Repentless more than I like the way that they sound on World Painted Blood or even Christ Illusion. Also, the fact that Terry Date could accomplish this feat should surprise exactly no one. Look and listen to the man's resume. Pantera, Soundgarden, White Zombie, Prong. Even the albums he produced for Deftones sound massive, and I hate Deftones. He is well versed in big guitars. The song itself is a sub 3 minute burst of thrash punk. Listening to it brings to mind those early West Coast hardcore punk influences that so affected Slayer in the early years. Alongside this punk bend, there's some nice tremolo picking. Really, the one guitar thing about this whole song that I'm not crazy about is the verse riff that's just alternating between two big open chords, like repeatedly. I think it sounds boring by Slayer standards. Thankfully, these are the only parts of the song that don't feel like they move, and therefore are just kind of there. King has a couple of leads throughout the song, and I feel like the solo bits are fitting for the overall track, and generally speaking, Kerry did a really good job with them. It's not an all-out shred fest, but that works in the context of this particular song again. Probably not much else to say about the leads, really. They're just kind of there. They're kind of a little frosting on the cake. As mentioned before, Repentless has not been in my regular rotation basically since it was initially released. I think one potential consequence of this fact is that I have completely missed or forgotten about some of the interesting quirks about this record. Bostaff's drumming on Atrocity Vendor is a good example of what I'm talking about. Re-listening to this song with a more critical ear while preparing for this episode, it occurred to me that Paul largely eschews the classic Slayer drum formula of like the big dramatic drumming. There really aren't any massive tom fills. In fact, the vast majority of the fills on this song are either primarily or even exclusively on the snare, with little to no toms. We know Paul is well capable of very creative, big tom forward kind of drum fills, but he chose to show a bit more restraint on this one. To pull the curtain back a little on the show, I'm writing this episode not far removed from recording the Abolish Government Superficial Love episode. The reason why I even bring this up is because for that track I made mention of the fact that Bostaff's drumming was largely straightforward, probably because of the source material being hardcore punk, which rarely, if ever, placed any emphasis on big technical drum parts or fills. It was a smart decision to rein the drums in a bit in kind of keeping with the punk rock soul of the songs. Fast forward to Atrocity Vendor, and we have a very hardcore punk influenced song and a talented drummer that understands the assignment. As the tension of the song builds, Paul does some thoughtful and skillful double bass rhythms and accents, always serving the track, which Paul really seems to excel at. But he never goes ham because that's not what this song calls for. In that respect, Paul may be the MVP on this one. Props. So we've arrived again at a song that is late in the band's career, with lyrics penned by Kerry King. I absolutely acknowledge that people change and evolve over time. Artists often evolve. In fact, I respect when artists evolve and take chances. Kerry King's lyrical approach has certainly changed since the days of Show No Mercy, but opinions vary on whether this was wholly a positive thing. Later era King is often focused on writing forceful lyrics, with a focus on contempt for society and institutions, especially organized religion, which I acknowledge is not a new thing for Slayer, obviously, but now is much more direct and grounded. He's also physical violence, and let's be honest, a lot of kind of what sounds like tough guy posturing. Atrocity Vendor is very much in the physical violence realm. The lyrics are relatively simple and straightforward. I don't think he's speaking in metaphors here. Truth be told, the lyrics on this one don't do much for me. That's not intended as a knock, it's just generally not my style. There are a couple of exceptions to this for me on God Hates Us All, but we'll get there in time. Delivery-wise, Tom sings this one with less of the screaminess that filled God Hates Us All, and more of that late-era kind of barking cadence, punctuated occasionally by a big Uriah scream. Listening to it, I had a couple of thoughts for what maybe drove this vocal approach. First, I think that King's lyrics, which are obviously written around the riff, called for kind of a choppy, short burst approach. But second, there's certainly a part of me that wonders if Tom was curating his studio performance to accommodate potential future live performances. In other words, did he undersing some of the Repentless tracks to make things a bit easier for his voice once they were touring the record afterward? I mean, you could still hear the power in Tom's voice when he chooses to show it, but it just feels like he just doesn't show it quite as much as he did on previous records. Maybe it's also a function of age, I don't know. But then you see and hear Tom's live performances on the Repentless and on the final campaign tours, and he is still very capable of going full throttle vocally. This is all speculation, of course. Tom was still delivering on Slayer's final album, but there was certainly something different vocally in the overall vibe of the record. Okay, so here we are, at the very first appearance of the Repentless record in our overall song ranking. Look, Atrocity Vendor is actually better than I remember it being when it was first released. And it certainly is not the weakest song Slayer has ever released. But, man, does it sit pretty much forever in the shadow of many of its predecessors. With that in mind, I'm thinking dropping it into the number 7 spot would be a pretty fair placement for Atrocity Vendor. A pretty respectable rating, where it sits just behind Aggressive Perfector. This doesn't necessarily represent rankings of future Repentless tracks, but it will be interesting to see where those songs land given this slightly underwhelming valuation of Atrocity Vendor, which may actually be one of the stronger songs on the album, truth be told. Alright, on our next episode, let's have a second dip into 2009's World Painted Blood with a listen to Beauty Through Order. It's another serial killer inspired track from Tom Araya and Jeff Hanneman. Let's see how they pull this one off. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're hearing this. If you want to drop a line to the show directly to give me a pat on the back for my efforts, congratulate me for 10 episodes so far, correct me, or tell me why you think Repentless deserves to be ranked in the top half of Slayer's album catalog. P.S. You might be crazy. I am always happy to read your messages at slaytozpod@gmail.com. That's slaytozpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, remember.